Our commitment to human worth, it's a basic for most of us in ethical societies. What do we mean by that concept? Where did it come from? So when I was thinking about writing today's platform, I had this idea I was going to put in everything I could think of about human worth and what I knew about it or what I thought about it. And it turns out I could only put about a third of what I was thinking of adding here into the platform because you wouldn't want to listen to me talk for an hour. So I'll start by telling this story. Some years ago, I was at a multi-faith gathering. And I was at a session where I was learning about an organization that brings people together across religious lines in a project to advocate for the common good. The main speaker kept talking about the rationale for doing this was we all believe in one humanity because we all believe in the same God. Well, in ethical culture, of course, we don't require any such belief, and many of our members don't have such a belief. Yet we are very committed to working for the common good of humanity. We are what I call a platypus among religious groups. We don't much look like what people assume a religion is, and yet we have the legal status of a religion. We do weddings and memorial services, and the majority of our members, though not all, personally consider this their religious ideals. The founders of ethical culture rejected a lot about traditional religion, but instead of seeing themselves as outside of religion, saw themselves as rethinking religion. So after this presentation that I listened to, and after hearing over and over about the one God we all believed in, supposedly, I joined the line to ask questions of the speaker. I told him that most of what he said was exactly in our line with our objectives in ethical culture, and working with others across belief lines was also important to us. But I asked him if we would be welcome in the coalition if we didn't share that belief in a God. So he sort of looked puzzled and said, well, what do you believe in if not a God? Well, without hesitation, I answered, the worth of every person. He stepped back a step, put his hand on his heart, and said slowly to me, that is really deep. And he paused for a moment to take it in before we continued to talk. Yes, I think it is really deep. When I was serving an ethical society in Virginia, every Sunday driving to the meeting, we would see a lot of cars with bumper stickers about, I believe in God or Jesus. And our ethical society had bumper stickers too. My favorite one was, we believe in you. To believe in something in the religious sense is actually not about whether you think something exists or not. It is about whether you have a commitment to it. The word belief comes from a root word meaning love. You can transfer belief as what you are in love with or love. What is most beloved to you? What motivates you, inspires you? What are you committed to? What are you deeply committed to? So today I'm going to try to do this tour of what we mean by human worth and what it means to be committed to human worth. And it will be a rather quick tour. The topic deserves a much more detailed study than I can do in this short talk. Some 25 years ago, I did a survey of how different religious groups use that concept of human worth, of how many use the actual words of human worth. I found then that only 3 groups use the term widely: ethical culture, Unitarian Universalists, and Roman Catholics. Now that has changed somewhat over 25 years. I now find it in, for instance, those more religiously liberal Protestant groups when they are talking about full inclusion of and respect for LGBTQ plus people. In the secular realm, the concept of human worth is tied intimately to the concept of human rights. In 1986, the United Nations General Assembly provided guidelines for whether something should be considered a human right. What they said was to ask, is it, and this is a quote, of fundamental character and derived from the inherent dignity and worth of the human person? So we're talking this year in the AEU Assembly with programs from June into August about the whole truth of America's founding. So one of the things I did was go back to some of that history to talk about human worth. For the Assembly and for this talk, I reread Thomas Paine's Rights of Man for the first time in many years. One line stood out to me. A people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with a power which knowledge gives. Wow, if more people understood that today, we would have a better self-government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And speaking of such things, Bastille Day was July 14th, just a few days ago. If we're going to talk about human worth, I think it is instructive to look back on that time too, when a large group of French people freed the prisoners, many of them political prisoners, from the French prison called the Bastille. And for that history, Paine's Rights of Man is worth spending a few minutes with. Paine in this essay notes a famous sermon in 1789 by the Reverend Dr. Richard Price. Price was a nonconformist minister in London and a correspondent with many key figures in the American and French revolutions. And he was also a key figure in the liberalization of religion. Thomas Jefferson, Joseph Priestley, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams. He was also a friend of the philosopher David Hume, who wrote on ethics, and of the philosopher and writer Mary Wollstonecraft. The Reverend Dr. Price, in that infamous sermon, supported the idea that people had three fundamental rights: to choose their own government, to remove from office those who commit misconduct, and to frame a government. He also notes that this is a right of the whole, not particularly a right of individuals. Well, Edmund Burke, another English figure, denounced that sermon, stating in his criticism of it that an act of parliament 100 years before had, in the name of the people of England, submitted to the king, and using the words for themselves, their heirs, and posterities forever. Thomas Paine, by the way, writes about how this astonished and disappointed him. Well, Paine, criticizing Burke, argues that no parliament can simply assume a right binding anyone to the end of time as to how they will be governed. To quote Paine, every age and generation must be as free to act for itself in all cases as the ages and generations which preceded it. In other words, Paine notes that Burke assumes an authority over the living by the dead. In contrast, Paine goes back to what is to him the origin, the creation of human beings at the beginning by who he calls their maker, and the creation as one unity with equality. Paine points out that all the known religions preach the basic humanity, the unity of humanity. I should add, Paine's ideas about the deity were explicitly deist, not Christian. And for that, in his time, he was called a dirty little atheist. Paine goes on to speak then of the natural rights and the natural dignity of man. And I use the term man both because he did and because it's worth looking at that. And that they were natural, as in it is part of our nature, part of being human. The rights of man. Well, of course, for many of us, man as a term is problematic. For one thing, because it clearly did not include women. Olympe de Gouges, a French writer, responded to the same French document that both Burke and Thomas Paine were writing about, a French document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. It had upset Burke, and Thomas Paine was defending it. Olympe de Gouges published her own statement, which she titled A Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. Before the French Revolution, she had been involved in the growing campaign in France to abolish the institution of enslavement within France and all of its colonies. She had also been critical of French colonialism in general. She asserted in her declaration the right of women to free speech, including the right to name the fathers of their children, which was not a right that women had in France at the time. She asserted the right of women citizens to vote. She was soundly denounced for forgetting her own place, and when the Jacobins took control of the revolution, was herself sent to the guillotine. So man is a problematic term because it doesn't include women and wasn't meant to, but it's also, I think, problematic because it is singular and thus misleading. It tends to lead us to assume that rights are only residing in an individual person. But Paine makes clear that his view is of the aggregate when he talks of the right to self-govern. His point is this: when those natural individual human rights, which are of the individual, are aggregated, that gives a power in society to collectively protect individual rights, not just of those who are already able to protect them for themselves, but for everyone. Paine today is much quoted and beloved of libertarians who want minimal government, but Paine was on the side of any government that worked for the rights of all, not just those powerful enough to have wealth and power and advantage. Through the mid-20th century, what I call Manglish tended to emphasize the rights of man, singular, and thus mostly focus on individual rights and not what happens when such rights are considered collectively. It is not about how one organizes a society that works to protect human worth and dignity for all. Well, Paine in this essay, The Rights of Man, was arguing against authoritarianism primarily, so he naturally emphasized individual rights and autonomy, but implicitly and explicitly defended the creation of governments that would protect such rights for all. A government of the people, by the people, and for the people, as later Theodore Parker would speak of, with Abraham Lincoln borrowing that construction for his Gettysburg Address. Well, recently our racial justice book group here in Riverdale was reading Eduardo Bonilla Silva's book, Racism Without Racists. Bonilla Silva includes there a really sharp critique on the ways that the Enlightenment idea of the individual has led to a focus on the individual in ways that often promote individual selfishness, greed, and power over other individuals. What I call a me individualism, not a we individualism. He points as well to Howard Zinn's chapter 5 in A People's History of the United States for examples of how individualism has often been used in elitist ways in our history. Focus on a simplistic individualism leads people to, for instance, oppose affirmative action, ignoring the history of discrimination, disenfranchisement, and exclusion, which has already produced substantial disparities and barriers. But despite that history of elitism and individualism, that is the individualism of me, not an individualism of everyone, Bonilla Silva acknowledges, and this is a quote from his book, the notion of individualism has been used by social reform movements such as the Jacksonian democracy movement of the 19th century, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, one man, one vote, and the women's suffrage movement of the early 20th century, one woman, one vote, to advance truly inclusive democratic agendas. Human rights and the idea of human dignity and human worth are about respect for the individual, but they are not about isolated individuals or just me. They cannot be. Any statement of a right is a statement that others in the human community have a responsibility to protect such rights. Thus, rights are inherently a relational concept. Worth is also rooted, I would contend, in the individual who is in relationship. We initially begin to discover the concept of worth for ourselves when we feel somehow that our own worth is violated. as it will be in a social world where others act in their own interests and sometimes ignore ours, just as we too often do the reverse. And then once we feel this for ourselves, we apply the concept of worth and dignity to others because we have empathy and compassion as human creatures. Or do we? If the concept of human worth in general, that is not just for me as worthy, but all as worthy, if that concept is grounded in both personal experience and empathy, then what about individuals who do not have the capacity for empathy or don't act on it? People who may have overcome their empathy to be cruel and to exclude some parts of the human family as worthy of compassion. You know, nearly every discussion of human worth gets at some point to what I call the Hitler question. Can we say that Hitler had human worth? You know, my quick answer I've learned for that question is to say that there's a different question really behind it. If Hitler, as a child, had not been beaten daily by one of the adults in his life, would he have become the person he did? He was not treated as a person of worth and dignity as a child. The so-called Hitler question of worth may indeed point not to that worth is not a good concept, but actually points to the likely consequences of not honoring the human worth of every person. And the likely consequences of not honoring the worth, a much worse, not a better world. A whole topic of what we do about those who don't exercise their human empathy, that's huge. And it's important enough for its own careful study and exploration. But just in brief, we know collectively, we as a species have the capacity for empathy. And so we can socially organize to express that empathy, even when some individuals within society may be unable or unwilling to do so. And sometimes the natural empathy capacity of an individual is reduced when they have been subjected to abuse and mistreatment by others who themselves are not acting on their empathy. Treating someone as not having human worth has consequences, not just for the person being treated badly, but in a cycle of violence for others. So what do I mean by human worth? What have others meant by it? How do we define it? Some who have studied the topic say that the concept of human worth is not at all helpful because it's just vague. One school of thought is that worth simply comes down to a call for the autonomy of every individual. Paine's right to be our own governors, although he was talking about collective and not individual autonomy. Another school of thought is that worth is about equity. That is, that everyone is entitled to the same respect and concern, to the same protection from harm, and the same nourishing of their flourishing. That the different thinkers believe worth boils down to different concepts. I think actually that should be a signal that none of those boiling downs is actually adequate. Human worth is not just a statement about human rights. It's an attempt to find some grounding for those human rights. So here's what I think it means, and I'm not alone in this. At its core, human worth is about human beings as having a distinctive significance, about mattering. Some thinkers, the philosopher Immanuel Kant is one, thought that the reason human beings had special significance was because only human beings had the capacity to make and understand ethical choices. Therefore, the distinctiveness of humans over animals was what grounded our worth. More recent thinkers have argued, in contrary to that to have a distinctive significance of the human does not imply whether or not other animals also have their own distinctive significances. Human worth and the worth of other beings are not incompatible. Again, that's a topic for more depth another time. So what do we mean by having an internal significance, though? For some people, it's about a kind of sanctity or perfectionism. You'll hear that sometimes when people refer to the sacredness of every person. Now, that version is especially common in people who root human worth in being the image of their God, as do Roman Catholics. Other groups, which is that other group which often uses the language of human worth. For those people, there is a divine or cosmic source of that significance, that sanctity that has been granted. And for some, that internal significance of the human being is about having agency, the ability to make choices and act on them, and it is about liberation. A materialistic humanism might look at how human beings evolved to be cooperative, and with both a sense of individual consciousness and a sense of empathy, and that others also have such consciousness. We want to stop or heal suffering that we experience, and we can also extend that desire to wanting that for others, all others. You have probably heard over and over in ethical culture, maybe other places, that the so-called golden rule exists in most human cultures in some form or another. Don't treat others in ways you wouldn't want to be treated, and do treat others as you want to be treated. The idea of reciprocity. We first find this in human history explicitly written as early as 2000 BCE in ancient Egyptian texts. It's in ancient India, Greece, Persia, Rome, and likely in cultures where writing was not invented or passed down. It's found in Buddhism, Christianity, Confucianism, Hinduism, Islam, Jainism, Judaism, Sikhism, Taoism, Wicca, Yoruba, Zoroastrianism, and the declaration toward a global ethic that hangs in our meeting room in Riverdale includes a commitment to that reciprocity ethic. It exists in godly and godless ethical systems. Who disagrees with that? I went chasing that down. It turns out that there are a few explicitly neo-Nazi groups today that specifically deny that the golden rule and reciprocity is a good thing. There have also been some who criticize it for not taking into account diverse needs or values, and thus not thoroughly expressing human worth and human rights. Immanuel Kant, for instance, argues that a different approach is to see people as subjects, that is, agents of their own moral choices with their own purposes to fulfill, rather than just as subjects, as objects, rather, people we use for our own purposes. As Kant put it, act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a means only. If we use another person without regard to their moral agency, as when an adult sexually abuses a child, then we are expressing through our action the ethics that I alone matter. I alone have worth and dignity. You, they do not matter as much as I do. Their worth is less than mine. That is the ethic expressed in abuse. Kant also said, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In other words, when we act to abuse others or when we act in respect of others, we are by our action defining our actual ethics. Felix Adler, the founder of the ethical movement, had studied the philosophers of ethics as well as the foundational texts of many religions. Did you know that he could read and write Sanskrit and Pali, as well as Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek? Felix Adler was especially inspired by Kant, although also a critic of him. He further evolved Kant's idea. Act so as to bring out the unique best in another and thereby in yourself. Acting towards others in ways that respond to their uniqueness and worth is exactly how we bring out our own best, our own uniqueness and worth. Adler found the idea of uniqueness crucial to the concept of worth. His argument works for some of us, not for others, but he was searching for a way to ground human worth without having to rely on created in God's image or some related divine connection. What he came up with was this: every person is unique. If we were not unique, we'd be a complete duplicate of another, and one of us would be superfluous, not necessary. We are, as unique beings, each an essential part of making the universe. If any of us were missing, the universe would be different. Our part in the universe helps to make the universe. That is a huge significance. So do these ideas of Kant or Adler replace the golden rule? I would make the argument that in fact Kant's and Adler's alternatives are examples of it, just more sophisticated. We each and all want to be treated as the unique human beings we are. And we don't want to be treated as if we are a mere duplicate of another. And so that is the universal ethic. Treat others in the way that we flourish when we are treated, in ways that bring out our unique best, and the way that will bring out our collective best as well. Felix Adler himself made this argument about human worth. We first know human worth in ourselves when we feel ourself to be violated somehow through unfairness, injustice, even abuse. When we don't have a need met, we feel that need more sharply. When we're hungry, we long for food. When we're excluded, we long for belonging. When we're restricted in our choices, we long for autonomy. When we're treated as worthless, we long to be treated as worthy. We recognize an atrocity when it's committed against ourselves. We also recognize needs when they are met. When we are treated, as we talked about in the exercise this morning, when we are treated as a person of worth, we recognize that worth, and we know it helps us to flourish to be the person we could be. And then because we have the capacity to realize that others are human beings like us who can also feel such violation, because of that, we are capable of recognizing when others are victims of harm or atrocity, even at our own hands. And thus, we accept responsibility for not committing harms and atrocities. We are capable by our human capacities to be conscious of ourself as distinct from others. There is in that possibility that we make choices just for that distinct self. But we are also capable of seeing others as individual selves with capacities to suffer or thrive, and to see their selves as connected with ours. We are not just conscious individuals, we are social cooperative conscious individuals. When we make the ethical interests of others our own, then we are in fact becoming the ethical people that we have the capacity to be. So human worth is about relationship. Human worth as a concept is one about human significance, not usefulness. And thus it is intrinsic or inherent. It is in us, part of being human, not something we shed or lose by our behavior. The idea of worth being infinite is actually based on a mathematical concept. Some of you may remember from high school or college math. If you have two sets of numbers that are both infinite, they are equal. The set of all whole numbers and the set of even numbers may seem on the surface to be unequal, but mathematically they are in fact both infinite and therefore equal. In human beings, what you see on the surface, how people act, may lead you to think that the two are unequal. But the concept of infinite inherent worth helps us to see that as a human being, both are equally of worth. Sometimes we use in ethical discourse the term value to denote what usefulness others have for us and worth for that quality of inner significance. I had to go searching to figure out, why do we use one word for one and one word for the other? Well, it turns out that the choice of the two words is probably arbitrary. They mean in some contexts the same thing. One, value, comes to us via French roots, from an Indo-European root meaning to be strong. And the other, worth, comes to us via Germanic roots, from a different Indo-European root about bending and turning. All that I don't find very helpful. And language is a convention. So even though the two words in many contexts are just synonyms for the other, in ethical discourse, we can choose that they have different connotations for clarity. In considering human beings, worth is the word we use to describe that internal, infinite, immeasurable significance of every human being. And value is the instrumental importance or benefit of that person to us. There as means, the degree to which a person is useful. Some people contribute more to a world that has less suffering and more creativity, and some people contribute less or even negatively. We can recognize that. But if we're in a moral universe that values infinite inherent human worth, we can't think of people only in terms of how useful they are to us. And so we tend to choose the term value for when there is a relative ranking of usefulness, and reserve the term worth to remind us to treat people as ends and not just means, to refer to that inner significance. In ethics, human worth is not about whether you can prove there is some quality within a person. I knew someone long ago who scoffed at the idea of human worth because he was a scientist, and he knew that when you die, you don't suddenly weigh less. And so he argued the idea of worth makes no sense at all because you can't weigh it, so it's not real. Well, I would contend that, in fact, the idea of human worth is not about proving some reality of it. It is about a practice. Belief, not in the sense of does it exist, but are we committed to it? As early as the philosopher Durkheim, people began talking about a worth-based ethic as being an ethic or even religion of humanity, one centered on how we treat all of humanity, each person within humanity. And that idea is grounded on the concept of human worth, as are almost all systems promoting human rights. An ethic based on human worth is not simple. We are constantly balancing the recognition of the worth of each person with the recognition of the worth of all persons. We take into account not just individual identity, but human plurality and group identity, rather than assuming others are exactly the same as us. Our commitment then to human worth means that we are committed to acting as if every human being has that infinite inherent human worth. We don't spend a lot of time arguing about proving that there exists something called human worth in some material or cosmic sense. Instead, we look to see what effect belief in human worth has on behavior. What effect does it have on our behavior if we act as if every human being has infinite inherent worth and dignity? We observe that the violation of human worth creates suffering and a cycle of violence and even atrocities. And we observe that acting as if human beings have that infinite inherent worth is more likely to create a world in which all human beings can flourish to their full capacity and in which suffering is minimized. So I will stop there talking about human worth. Next month, I'm going to do another platform which follows and is the other side of the coin for ethical culture of our commitment to human worth, which is our commitment to relationship. And I hope I see you there too.